Okay. Next topic, respiration. I can't remember what chapter it is. I think it's 24 or 23. Anyway, you've already done the online questions, reading the chapter, answering the questions. That is not going to change whether we're online or we're in the classroom. So make sure you're not missing any of those because I'll be recording them. Once I record them, I'll put the scores and we'll make a copy of those just like everything is normal and post it on Facebook. Okay? So the topic right now is respiratory system. We talked about the circulatory system, and we found out the circulatory system was essentially broken into three parts. Characteristics of the heartbeat, all that stuff. And we did a lab on it. The other thing we did is we put blood vessels to carry what the heart was pumping, which is blood. And that was the vascular system. And we talked about the vascular system. And we know that capillaries are the only place that we can exchange nutrients and pick up waste. We did that. Remember when I showed you my vessel on my forearm? And then the last thing we did was blood. And that was our first online lecture. And we talked about why we have blood. Blood is because the cells cannot move. So we have to transport the nutrients to them and pick up their waste and take it and get rid of it, clean the blood. Now we're going to talk about the other nutrient that goes in blood, which is oxygen. And we talked about that. We said when we breathe in, we don't breathe in oxygen, we breathe in a solution of gases. And then in the lungs it separates. And we're targeting oxygen. Oxygen is used to make ATP in a process called cellular respiration, which we talked about, in an organelle called the mitochondria, which we talked about. We also talked several times about increasing the surface area in certain parts of your body so we had more efficiency in a localized area. Mitochondria that increase the surface area is called a matrix. And we know that cellular respiration occurs on the matrix on a specialized part called the crista or cristae. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take oxygen and we're going to take it in through a pathway beginning with the nose. We're going to go all the way down to the alveoli. You remember that. We've seen that remember we did the frog skin and we did the lungs. And we know the alveoli are the air sacs. And that was a question on the lab. What's the two names for the open areas? Air sac, alveoli. And that alveoli is lined with simple squamous epithelium, which is for diffusion. So when the oxygen mixture, so the air mixture comes down, the oxygen diffuses. Remember we talked about a surfactant. A surfactant is an enzyme that reduces surface tension, that allows oxygen to come out and go on the other side where a capillary bed is waiting for it. Then it's picked up by the blood and it's transported to the cells that are in need. Okay? So we're going to talk about that pathway. The first thing we're going to talk about is what is upper respiratory, what is lower respiratory, and the components of those. And then we're going to take the respiratory tree, which begins with the nose, then it goes to the trachea, then it goes to bronchi, then it goes to bronchioles, then alveolar ducts, and then here's our air sacs. Okay? And then, just like everything else in science, we have a name for all this. So we're going to talk about inspiration and expiration. And we're going to say we have divided respiration into 4 steps. And I'll list the steps for you. And then we'll go back to the hardcore names of the parts of the respiratory system. The nose, the nares, the nasal cavity, what the sinuses are, and how many sinuses do we have and where are they located at? What is an infected sinus called? Then we'll go to the pharynx. So once it leaves, when it comes in through the nose, it goes through the nasal cavity and it begins to travel down the pharynx. The pharynx, there's 3 parts to it: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngeal pharynx. Then we'll go to the larynx because that's where things are separated. That's where the upper respiratory and the lower respiratory separate. It's also where the trachea and the pharynx separate. and that's the larynx, and there's 9 pieces of cartilage, and I'll show you what that is on a model. And that's the thyroid, the epiglottis, and the cricoid are single. The arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform are doubles, and then we'll do the glottis. When I get to the glottis, the board will be full. We'll take a quick break. I'll erase everything, and we'll pick up from there and go into lung volumes. Okay, here we go. You see this term up here, Otorhinolaryngology. Now, before, I don't want to say you dummied it down, but in the phone book, when you looked up your ear, nose, and throat specialist, it said he was an otorhinolaryngologist. What that breaks down into is ear, nose, respiratory. Ear, nose, and so somebody that specializes in diseases of the ear, the nose, and the respiratory tree is called an otorhinolaryngologist. Okay, I don't remember if that's on exam, but it's kind of cool to know. Okay, next, what is the difference between upper and lower respiratory? You've heard of, you go to the doctor and they say you have an upper respiratory tract infection. What does that mean? Take your larynx, okay, your voice box, your Adam's apple, everything above it is upper respiratory. Everything below it is lower respiratory. So mostly when your sinuses become infected, that is called an upper respiratory tract infection. To be specific, it involves your nose, which is your sinuses also, the pharynx, and it stops at the larynx, your voice box. That is upper respiratory. Lower respiratory, again, we're at the larynx, the trachea, the single tube that runs down into your lungs. When that single tube branches, it's called a bronchi. When the bronchi subdivide, it is called bronchioles. Now, what is the difference between bronchi and bronchioles is cartilage. The pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, and the bronchi all have cartilaginous rings. And what I mean by that is, if you take your fingers, separate them, don't hit your Adam's apple, you'll start coughing. Go right down the side, you'll feel ridges. What I'm doing right now is I'm running my fingers down those ridges right there. Those ridges, we already know, are made out of hyaline cartilage. You saw it in the microscope. And what they add to this is they are C-shaped. So if we take the letter C, turn it on its side, and back it up here, you'll see it's open in the back. That allows elasticity because our neck is moving. We're swallowing and doing stuff, okay? Up here is the pharynx. So up here is your nose. Here's your, what we call our throat, which is the pharynx. And it comes down here, and it's a common passageway for food and air. When it gets to the larynx, it splits into 2 tubes. One tube, no cartilage, esophagus, goes down to the stomach. The other tube continues through the center of the larynx, where there's an opening called a glottis, and it goes down the trachea. The trachea, single tube. This is a model we have in lab. This is the same thing I was holding. This is the trachea. You can barely see it here. Here's the trachea coming down into in between where the heart was at. And then you can see it splits. When it splits, it's called a bronchi. Still has cartilaginous rings, cartilage rings to hold open the air passage. That will subdivide. Right side, 3. Left side, 2. Right side lungs, 3 lobes. Left side, 2. So you can see, and these are called secondary bronchi. The secondary bronchi, there's 2 on the left side, 3 on the right. When they first branch from the trachea, it's called primary bronchi. Now, what started this was the difference between bronchi and bronchioles. Bronchi have cartilage, so this is a bronchi. When it splits and there's no cartilage around it, it's called bronchioles. Okay? That leads to alveolar ducts, which leads to alveoli, which are our air sacs. We've talked about that. Now to picture this, Picture a cluster of grapes. As you know, if you take table grapes and you go to the grocery store and you take a bunch of them, not when they're still on the vine. So, and you notice that vine is very thick, okay? That's a bronchi. Whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary, doesn't make any difference, okay? It's a bronchi. It's got cartilaginous rings on it. Then off of the bronchi is a branch smaller, so there's many more of them, and these are called bronchioles. Bronchioles do not have cartilaginous rings. Function of the cartilaginous rings, keep the tube open, okay? But when we actually get down into lung tissue, that thing is constantly expanding and contracting, expanding and contracting. And if you had a solid structure around it, cartilage, it would tear the simple squamous epithelium. So it has to be elastic, okay? So the bronchi do not have any cartilage. And now you know why. Is so they can be elastic. The only problem is the entire respiratory tree is covered with smooth muscle. So we can dilate it and we can constrict it when necessary. So if you're allergic to something, the smooth muscle wants to contract, but it can't contract through the cartilage. So the passageway stays open. So our pharynx, our trachea, and our bronchi stay open, even though the smooth muscle is contracting around it. But the bronchioles, since it's only smooth muscle, can contract and squeeze off the air passage, which is a condition known as asthma. Okay? And I'll get to asthma down the end. But what I wanted you to learn from this is the difference between bronchi and bronchioles are cartilage. I wanted you to know that the reason for cartilage is to keep the air passageway open. It comes with a price. The price is that the bronchioles can constrict so no air can get down into where it's going to exchange at in the alveoli, which is a condition called asthma. Okay? Okay, so that brought us down to here. You understand the difference between bronchi, bronchioles. The trachea is what leads past the larynx. This is the trachea, there's one. When it branches, that is no longer called the trachea, it's called bronchi. And in bronchi, you're going to see that there's primary, secondary, and tertiary, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it's the primary bronchi. Then they subdivide, 2 on the left, 3 on the right, 2 on the left, 3 on the right, and now they're called secondary bronchi. Okay? All right, now back to this. Inspiration, expiration. Inspiration, to breathe in. That's what that means. So the anatomical term for taking air into the body is called inspiration. To expel air is called expiration. It's not called exhale. It's not called inhale. It's inspiration, expiration. And if you think about it, your final breath, what are you said to be? Expired. Because there's no more air going in. There's 4 divisions of respiration. 4 divisions of respiration. First, this is on your exam, pulmonary ventilation, also called respiration. Air into the lungs. So I'll put over here, lungs. You're taking in ambient air, you're bringing them into the lungs. Second one, external respiration. This is from the lungs to blood. That's going into the capillaries. Third, internal respiration. That's from the blood to the cell. Okay, now that means we're following oxygen. So let's look at this. Oxygen into the lungs, oxygen into the blood, Oxygen from the blood to the cell. Now, I'm asking you, what happens once it gets into the cell? Does it just hang out in the cytoplasm or what? Time's up. It goes to the cellular respiration in the mitochondria. There it's utilized to become ATP, okay, or functions to make ATP. Okay, it isn't part of ATP, it functions to become ATP. Okay, now, let's go to the parts. What does it begin with? What does respiration begin with? Well, if you keep your mouth open, you'd say, well, it begins with a mouth. No, it begins with a nose. If you close your mouth, can you still breathe? You have to have a constant passageway to get oxygen, ultimately oxygen, into the cells. That means you cannot stop breathing. Okay, so nose, mouth is a secondary backup, but nose is number one. Okay, what are the nose composed of? You have holes. A hole in a body is called an orifice. You have right here at the edge, that is called the external nares. The holes are the nares. External, okay, here's your nose, hole, hole, external nares. As we continue the passageway up to get to the sinuses, to the nasal cavity, we go to the internal nares. So the nares, you have a right and you have a left. Right here at the opening is called external. As it passes through that into the nose, that is called internal nares. That leads to the nasal cavity. We can't see that, okay, because there is a septum. If you put your finger in your nose and move it to one side or the other, you're going to feel something. The front part of it is cartilage, the back part of it is a bone. And we're going to learn that when we do the bones of the skull, and we're going to talk about the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid and the vomer. Those are the two bones that make up the bone part of the septum. And then there's the cartilage, which is more anterior. So let's see what we know. Nose is divided into nares. Nares, there are external and internal nares that leads to the nasal cavity. What separates the nares is a septum. This little bit of skin that sticks out over the front of the nares is called a vestibule. The nasal cavity consists of sinuses. And there are 4 sinuses, and they match the bones of the skull. And you felt yourself when you have an upper respiratory tract infection, you're rubbing your forehead like this to get some relief because you feel the pressure on it. That sinus right there is called the frontal sinus. Now, when we get to the bones of the skull, you're going to realize when you take the skull cap off, there's another bone that goes all the way across from orbit to orbit, across the back of the nose. That's called the sphenoid bone. And it also has sinuses. Let me back up what sinuses are. You know what a honeycomb is, or a labyrinth, or a maze. That's what your sinuses are. So they're little passageway lined with goblet cells and pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And what they do is there's blood in there, so it allows the air to come in. The air that you're breathing in is filtered by cilia, and it's warmed. That's the function of the sinuses. So back to it again. Number 1 was the frontal sinus. Number 2 is the sphenoidal sinus. That's that butterfly or bird-like thing that goes all the way across the floor of the skull. The other one is the nose bone, which is called the ethmoid. So ethmoid sinus. So that's the one we think of mostly when we do sinuses. And then the last one is the maxillary, which is the one your upper teeth are in. So when you have sinusitis, and I'm gonna get to that in a minute, you feel pressure here on your temples. That's from the sphenoidal sinus. You feel it in your forehead, and that is the frontal sinus. You feel it in your cheekbone, that's the maxillary sinus, and then in your nose itself. Those are the 4 sinuses. When those become infected, usually your MD will say you have sinusitis and an upper respiratory tract infection. Okay? Sinusitis, infection of the sinuses. Okay. Okay. If you put your tongue on the roof of your mouth, that in the back, that is the palatine bone. In the front, it's the maxillary bone. Let's just call it the roof of your mouth. Everything above that, so you have to go back down your throat and go back out towards your nose. That part of the pharynx, which is divided into 3 parts, and we're talking about a tube that's up above the larynx, is called the nasopharynx. Okay, so once again, tongue on the roof of your mouth, anything above that, above that palatine bone of your palate, is called the nasopharynx. It connects your Nares, essentially your Nares, your nasal cavity, with your throat. Okay? Nasopharynx. In there, I'm going to jump you ahead to the ear. When we hear sounds, what it is movement of molecules coming into the ear, striking a drum, which we call the tympanic membrane or eardrum. That starts it turning into a mechanical movement. Attached to that eardrum is a bone. In fact, there's 3 bones, which we collectively call ossicles. The one that touches it, you may have heard as the hammer, properly called the malleus or malleus. Articulating with that is another bone called an anvil. Articulating with that is a 3rd bone called the stapes. The common names for those, and here's how small they would be. I'm bringing it up to you. See if it works. This is the hammer. This is the anvil. This is the stapes. Hammer, proper term, malleus or malleus. Anvil, proper term, incus. And the stapes, the smallest bone in the body. And that's the one that articulates with the inner ear. Okay, now back out to our respiratory system. When sound waves hit the tympanic membrane, we have to turn them into mechanical movement. In order to get mechanical movement, we have to take those moving particles in the air and make it start moving those bones. The tympanic membrane is what does it. The bone that leads up against the tympanic membrane is called the malleus or malleus. We call it the hammer. Articulating with it is the bone that's in between, which is the anvil of the incus. The 3rd bone looks like a foot stirrup. Call it the stirrup, but it's properly called the stapes. Okay, that is the inner, what's called the middle ear. The middle ear is air-filled. The outer ear is air-filled. So when we go up, back up, when we go to, there's invaders. We talked about this when we did blood, called antigens that want to get into our body. We have to shield that off. But we also have to open up our body to really, to sense stimuli. So if we want to see, we have to open up our eyes, which means that's susceptible to infection. We have to be able to breathe, so that's susceptible to infection. We have to eat, so that is susceptible to infection. We have to reproduce, so that is susceptible to infection. So what we do is we try and safeguard that. Since our ears are always open, that's real close to the brain, we put the tympanic membrane there, the eardrum. And that forms 2 things. It closes off the middle and inner ear, and it takes those sound waves and turns them into mechanical waves. Now, because we go up and down in altitude, those air particles are further apart and closer together. So we have to be able to keep the constitutive density of air particles on the outside consistent and the same as the air particles on the middle ear. In order to do that, we have to make sure we don't get infection. So what the body has done is put 2 tubes in there that feed off the nasal pharynx and go into the middle ear for equalization. Those tubes are called Eustachian tubes. And this is for air equalization. Are we good? Also in the nasal pharynx is the lacrimal canal. Every time you blink your eye, you secrete fluid. That fluid then travels across the eye and goes somewhere. And it goes into a canal right in the corner of your eyes called the lacrimal canal. And you'll see that when we study the skull, because there's a hole in the bone. The bone is called the lacrimal bone. The canal is called the lacrimal foramen. That is also drains right alongside the tube for the eustachian tube. So the eustachian tube has air in it. The lacrimal canal has tears in it. And it goes down. We'll talk about it in a minute. Also are your tonsils. Now, I will talk in detail about your tonsils when we do the digestive process, because that's why one of the things that they're there for. But you have 3 sets of tonsils. One is called the adenoids or pharyngeal tonsils. That's number 1, and they're found in the nasal pharynx, so you don't see them. When you open up your mouth and your tonsils are inflamed, that's not those. Okay, that's the next set down. So when you can't see it, if you could suck your tongue back and put it on the top of your palate, you could actually feel where the eustachian tube comes out, one on each side. The lacrimal canal comes out on each side, and your adenoids, also called your pharyngeal tonsils. Got it? Okay, now, from your palate where your tongue was touching, straight on back to the back of your throat and down to your top of your larynx is called the oropharynx. And you have 2 sets of tonsils there, the palatine tonsils and the lingual tonsils. The palatine tonsils are the ones you see when you open up your mouth and you can see the back when they're inflamed and they might have been red or swollen. That is your palatine tonsils, one on each side. The next one is your tongue. If you've ever stuck your tongue way out at the base of your tongue, it looks like there's a blister on it. That is called the lingual tonsil. Some people say there's only one. Some say it's actually divided into 2. Doesn't really matter. Test purposes, you have 3 tonsils. Pharyngeal, also called the adenoids, palatine, and lingual. Now, what are tonsils? Tonsils are adenoids, lymphatic tissue. Because when we're born, we essentially have no immune system. And we're all of a sudden, we're in a very isolated sac. And that sac opens up and we come out and we're susceptible to all the bacteria and viruses and things that are in the air and on people and so on and so forth. So we have to have our first line of defense, which is our skin. The second line of defense is our immune system. And the immune system is our white blood cells. And our white blood cells are stored all over our body in reservoirs called nodes, lymph nodes. And the tonsils are huge lymph nodes. And once we get to especially about 6, 7 years old, and especially puberty, we have built up immunity. And the tonsils don't play that big of a factor anymore. So they begin to undergo atrophy. So after age 1, 2 years old, they begin to undergo atrophy to where when you're an adult, you probably don't even have them, or you just have remnants of them. Okay, so now you know what tonsils are. First, adenoids, pharyngeal, same name, same one. Palatine and lingual. Those are lymph nodes called tonsils, and you know where they're at. Good test question. The third, okay, we said nasopharynx. Let me change colors for you. Nasopharynx, oropharynx, and the last one is laryngopharynx. Laryngopharynx, not really much to say, except for it's the area around the top of the larynx. So it's right where the pharynx divides into 2, one being the esophagus going to the back that goes to the stomach, in the model, you see this brown tube is the esophagus. Back up here, it splits, and the esophagus goes down to the stomach, and the trachea splits and goes to the lungs. Okay, larynx. Larynx. There's 9 pieces of cartilage forming the larynx. 9 pieces of cartilage forming the larynx. We good? Okay. And here's what we're talking about. This piece up here is the hyoid bone. It holds the base of your tongue. It holds the base of your tongue down. Okay? We saw this when I took you through the beginning of the bone lab. And I said we would discuss it when we did the larynx. Well, now we're down to the larynx. Here's the hyoid bone, which is a bone in the body. I have a lab on that where you identify all the parts of the larynx, including the parts of the hyoid bone. I'll have that online for you. Then there's 9 pieces of cartilage. 3 are single, 3 are paired. The largest is the thyroid. The second largest piece is the cricoid, which I'm going to say is larger in the back, smaller in the front. And then the epiglottis, which is the tongue-like structure that covers the opening to the lungs, called the glottis, which is down here. Okay, so I'm going to draw it for you. Now, this is a side view of the larynx. This is the thyroid cartilage. This, smaller in the front, larger in the back, is the cricoid. These are the cartilage rings we talked about, made out of hyaline cartilage. This is the trachea. You may have called that your windpipe. We also have cartilaginous rings up here. This is called the pharynx. This bump out here is called the laryngeal prominence, also known as the Adam's apple. In developing in the uterus, subjected to testosterone, the laryngeal prominence enlarges in males, which means the vocal cords, vocal folds are longer, which means males' voices are characteristically lower. Okay. So, single pieces. 1, thyroid. I also put laryngeal prominence here. So you know that's the Adam's apple. Make sure you know both names. Know what caused it to get big. Know where it's at. Right here on the model. Side view, this is what you're looking at. Good? Second one, epiglottis. That's the flap-like lid that, and if I drew it, it would come up like this. The flap-like lid that goes over the glottis. So when you swallow, the only tube that whatever you're swallowing could go down is the esophagus. Here's the esophagus. Remember, this is the pharynx, and this is air going down. Well, when you swallow, you have a tube here called the esophagus, and it goes down to the stomach. And then right here, we have the diaphragm. It separates the thoracic from the abdominal cavity. Okay, the third type of single cartilage is the cricoid. Then the doubles, I'll put 2x, are the largest, which are called the arytenoids. And on top of the, now if I drew the arytenoids, they look like this. Okay, there's one on each side. The arytenoids, those are the arytenoids, and right on the top of the arytenoids is a small piece of cartilage that's curved. And the word for curve is cornice. It's called the corniculate. And that's the corniculate. And then embedded in the vocal folds, here's what I'm talking about. This is the backside. I've given you the side view. This is the backside. This funny shaped thing is the arytenoid. There it is. That's the arytenoid. The very tip making the curve is the corniculate, cornice, corniculate. Embedded in the vocal folds is this third piece of paired cartilage called the cuneiform. We don't see it in this model. Cuneiform. Now the arytenoids are attached. You can see them moving. The arytenoids are attached to the vocal folds, vocal cords. So when they move, they open up the glottis. When they close the glottis, which we do for speech. Epiglottis covers the opening to it. If you take your hand right now, put it on your laryngeal prominence, that's your Adam's apple. Don't push hard, you're going to cough. And swallow. Do it. What'd you notice? You should have noticed that the larynx went up. The model's deceiving because it looks like the epiglottis goes down, but the epiglottis is fixed. So what happens is when you swallow, your larynx goes up like this. You just felt it. So it actually goes up and closes off using the epiglottis as the tool to do that. The hole, now we're shifting gears, the hole that leads to the trachea in the floor of the larynx is called the glottis. A glottis is a hole. Okay, cut. Okay, we were talking about the larynx, which was the separation point between the upper respiratory and lower respiratory tracts. And you remember I drew it, and it was something like this with the cricoid in the back, and so on and so forth. If we look down the center of it, I'll just make it a box. We have the arytenoids. Remember those curved things like this? With the tips of them being the corniculate, cornice. And they're attached to vocal folds. This whole square, which is rounded, is all covered with vocal folds. The center of the vocal fold is thickened, and we call it the vocal cord. And it's attached anteriorly and then to the corniculate back like this. And all this is thickened vocal folds. And these are vocal cords. So when the arytenoids move, because they're attached to muscle, they'll tighten and loosen the vocal cords, changing our pitch for sound production. So there's vocal folds, vocal cords. Now, we talked about this leading posterior, inferior from the cricoid is the trachea, which is made of hyaline cartilage or lined with hyaline cartilage. That's the trachea. There's one of them also called the windpipe. And as we talked about before, when we get down here, here's our rings. It will go towards the lungs and it'll branch. And when it branches into two subtubes called primary bronchi. Here's where I'm at. Primary bronchi. There is one on the right, one on the left. So one on the right, one on the left. Then that subdivides, and I'll do it in green, to 3 on the right, 2 on the left, and those are called secondary bronchi. Each one of those secondary bronchi feed into a lung. That's why the left lung has 2 lobes. The right side has 3. Inside the lung itself, it subdivides numerous times, and those are called tertiary bronchi. And remember the difference between bronchi and bronchioles. Bronchioles do not have cartilage, bronchi do. So bronchi, remember we talked about being lined with smooth muscle so it could contract. And then remember I said we were talking about a cluster of grapes. And we said when you buy a cluster of grapes, you get this real thick vine thing that you can hold on to. And that equates to really tertiary bronchi. Okay, and then there's branches off of it. And the branches are called bronchioles. And off the bronchioles are smaller branches called alveolar ducts. And at the end of an alveolar duct is what you want. And that's the grape. And the grape is the alveoli, or air sac. And that's where we get nutrient and waste exchange. Is in the air sacs, only there. So here's where I was at. We talked about the bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveoli. We talked about bronchioles, besides saying that they didn't have cartilage rings. Think. Didn't we when we talked about asthma? Now you understand what asthma is. Okay, air's flowing down here, and I'll do it in orange. That's blue. Air's flowing down here, flowing down here, flowing down here. Takes a branch, and it wants to go here. But if smooth muscles contract, they close off the passageway. You can't get to where the exchange is at. That is a condition called asthma. Okay, back over here. Lungs, 2, 3. 2 on the left, 3 on the right. Remember we talked about, we said if something is really important for your survival, we put a sac around it. If it's really, really important for your survival, we put a sac and we put bone around it. Are your lungs important for your survival? The answer is obviously yes. Are they really, really important for your survival? The answer is yes. That means we're going to put bone around it, which is our rib cage, and we're going to put a sac on it, around it. And we talked about this sac before, and we said it's called a pleural sac. Remember, serous membrane? Okay, pleural membrane. And there's an outside called parietal, and there's an inside called visceral. And remember, it's in the thoracic cavity, and the thoracic cavity is subdivided into 2 cavities, the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. We talked about the pericardial when we did the cardiovascular, and we also had a lab on it where it was asked as a question. The cavity for your lungs is called the pleural cavity. Where the fluid is between the parietal and visceral, there's a fluid, and that's called the pleural fluid. Just like in the heart, reduce friction, pull away heat. If that serous membrane, the pleural membrane, becomes infected, or the pleural fluid becomes increases, it's called a condition called pleurisy. Okay, muscles of respiration. When we are just sitting, relaxing, and breathing, I don't want to call it shallow breathing, but for right now, I'm going to say it's shallow breathing. It's called normal breathing. what's happening is your ribs are twisting like this. You have an airtight cavity with the only opening is your nose going down to your lungs. So if you increase the volume in your thoracic cavity, air is going to rush in, has no choice. If you decrease it, air is going to come out, has no choice. The amount and volume of air that we breathe into your lungs just under normal breathing is about 150 milliliters. Remember the graduated cylinder that was on your exam? It was 150 milliliters. It's not very much. The muscles that do that are called the intercostals. Intercostal muscles. This is for normal breathing. External is just the opposite. External is for inspiration, breathing air in. They get the word external not from expiration, but from there on the outside. So the muscles you see most superficial are external. Internal is for expiration, and they're behind it. They're the deep muscle. When you have ribs, now let me back up. Those muscles, since you're breathing 60, 70 times a minute, those muscles are being constantly contracted, relaxed, contracted, relaxed. They're tough. But we eat that when we eat ribs. And if you've ever cooked ribs, you know you can't just throw them on a barbecue for 15 minutes and then plan on eating it. You have to cook them for long periods of time so the protein breaks down. What you're eating is the internal and external intercostals. The next time you have them, before you prepare them, look at them. You'll see the outside, the fibers are going one way, and you flip it over on the other side, the fibers are going the other way. The fibers on the inside are the internal, the ones on the outside are external intercostals. Now we know that sometimes we have to breathe really deep. Then we employ some other, anything that enlarges the thoracic cavity is a muscle of inspiration or expiration. So when we want to get a lot of air in, our diaphragm is cupped like this. So when we contract it, it flattens out. When it does, it opens up the thoracic cavity. So the abdominal of the diaphragm is used for inspiration. Now, in order to get it out, yes, the diaphragm can relax, but we also use the muscles of our abdominal cavity, okay, which we call collective the abdominal muscles, which is the external and internal obliques, rectus abdominis, and that squeezes. When it does, it pushes your internal organs up against the diaphragm and causes expiration. Now, we were talking about how air gets in. We said it's a closed system. So the only thing that's open is your nose. So if we increase the volume of the chest cavity, air is going to go in, has no choice. But it's also going to go in the area of least resistance and shortest distance. So if you open your mouth, you're going to breathe through your mouth because it's much larger. If your mouth is closed, your nose is closed, you can't breathe. If you have what's called a sucking wound, and you'll probably see this sometime in your life, that means there's a hole between the intercostals going into the thoracic cavity. That's called a pneumothorax. It's a hole into the cavity, which means the air is going to go in and out there because it's the shortest distance. It's only that far. So even though all the muscles are doing what they're supposed to be doing, it's not going to go through the nose or the mouth. It's going to go right through here, which means you're going to suffocate because the air can't get inside to the alveoli. Remedy, put your hand over it. Okay? That's what a pneumothorax is. Hemo, you know that means blood. A hemothorax means you've got blood in your thoracic cavity. And chances are, if you have a hole, if you have a pneumothorax, you got a hemothorax too, because obviously you're bleeding. Apnea. Whenever you see P-N-E-A, that means breathing. Remember, A in front of it means without. So when you don't breathe normally in a cycle, it says it's a condition of apnea, and you've heard of sleep apnea. What happens is people breathe in, relax, and then there's a long deficit before exhalation occurs and more inhalation, which makes your oxygen content go down. Okay, so people that have sleep apnea are oxygen deficient. So you're not recharging the cells in the body with oxygen at night like you're supposed to. Eupnea, that's E-U-P, breathing, U, normal breathing. Asthma, we talked about what it was. Bronchitis, doctors will say, now it should be bronchi, infection of the bronchi, but it's any lower tract infection. Emphysema. What emphysema is, some people say, well, it's caused from cigarette smoking. Well, yeah, it could be. But remember I was talking about the lungs and I said there's cells that secrete surfactants, and a surfactant is something that is a chemical, it's an enzyme that decreases surface tension, which means it allows oxygen to diffuse out of the lungs and into the blood. If those cells are compromised or you don't have any, you can't get the oxygen in to the blood. That is a condition called emphysema. Emphysema means you've lost the surfactant producing cells. Surfactant, an enzyme that allows oxygen to dissociate and go from the lungs from the alveoli into the blood. Emphysema is when you can't do that. So you see people with oxygen, it's because they have a few cells that are producing surfactant, but not enough. So they have to get raw oxygen. So that means whatever they get diffused, it has a high oxygen content. Pneumonia, okay? Pneumonia is caused from a bacteria. It's caused from a virus. It's caused from a parasite, okay? Pneumonia is a condition where your lungs begin to fill with mucus, okay? Okay, pulmonary embolism. We already talked about this. We did blood. This is a moving clot. A thrombosis is an embolism. When it's in your lungs, it's called a pulmonary embolism. Got it? Pulmonary edema means your lungs are filling up with fluid. And an example of that is pneumonia. How long can I keep you guys? I've got another 10 minutes if you got the time. Okay, well, good. Okay, let me erase this. I'm going to show a graph. We're going to be done. I'm getting in the swing of things now. Let's do it here. Yeah, I can just do that. Okay, here we go. Lung volumes. Okay, obvious with it, like it's obvious that with everything in anatomy, it's got a name. So remember we were talking about shallow breathing, which I said is not really shallow breathing, it's normal breathing. That amount, which we said was about 150 milliliters, that is going into your lungs and the exchange of coming out is called tidal volume. Tidal volume. So I'm going to put over here normal breathing. Now we also know that we can let's do it this way. I want you to put your hand on your chest and I want you to breathe normally. Don't think about it, because if you think about it, you're going to force some in and you're going to force them out. Okay, what you're feeling is tidal volume, about 150 milliliters. Now, you know, right when you get ready to exhale, so you brought your air in, you're getting ready to exhale, you can suck in more. Your diaphragm flattens out, your thoracic cavity opens up, and you breathe in more air. That is one of the types of forced air called inspirational reserve volume. Inspirational reserve volume. That's the upper part of forced air. Now, back with your hand on your chest. Just as you get ready to exhale, you can breathe out a little bit more. In other words, your abdominal organs are squeezed back up, hits the diaphragm out, and you squirt out the rest of that air. Okay, that's the other part of forced air called expirational reserve volume. Both of these, inspirational reserve volume and expirational reserve volume, is called your forced air. Okay? Expirational plus inspirational plus tidal volume is called vital capacity. So, hand on your chest again. If you breathe in as much as you can, and then you let it all out, that volume of air is called vital capacity. It can also be looked at the opposite way. All your air's gone, and then you fill it all back up. That same is the same volume. That's all forced air plus tidal volume, called vital capacity. Do you understand? I'm going to draw you a graph in just a minute. Okay? Now, we know that the last bit of air that you're breathing in never makes it down to your lungs. It gets into your pharynx or gets into the trachea or the bronchi. Never is exchanged. That is called reserve volume. Residual volume. The air that is not exchanged. Do you understand? Now, we also know that you've heard of a collapsed lung. That means these alveoli are collapsed. They're collapsed, the lung is collapsed. What keeps those things inflated is called dead air or dead space. So we say, keep inflated. Okay, before I draw the graph and I'm over here, surfactant we talked about. Remember that was an enzyme that lowered, I'll put lowered surface tension. And metaplasia. Remember from our tissues, plasia means tissue. I mean, on our discussion with tissues and cells, plasia means tissue. Meta means to change. This is seen in smokers. When they smoke, that heat destroys those nice goblet cells that are producing mucus. The nice columnar cells that have cilia on it that's clearing the air are burnt, become squamous skin cells. The process of going from one tissue type to another is called metaplasia. Metaplasia. That'll be on your exam. Okay, now last thing, I'm going to draw the graph for you, showing the lung volumes. Okay, x-axis, time, y-axis, volume. I'll just put oxygen, volume of oxygen in milliliters. All right, you're breathing. Tidal volume, tidal volume. And then you suck in a bunch of extra air. Okay, inspiratory reserve volume. Now you're back to tidal volume. Okay, and then just you get down, you squeeze out some more, and then you go back into tidal volume. I'm going to label these for you in just a minute. Okay, here we go with the labels. Tidal volume, normal breathing. Inspiratory, reserve, volume. Expiratory, reserve volume. Okay, now I'll do it another color. A, C, B. A plus B plus C is vital capacity. That's the maximum you can force in, force out, plus the tidal volume. So it's from here to here, which is this one also. So these two, these three, make tidal volume. And you notice how the graph, there's still some volume of air here. That is a combination of dead space, dead air, and residual volume. Remember, dead air, dead space keeps the alveoli open, the alveolar ducts, and residual air is the air that's not quite, it's not exchanged. It doesn't get down to the alveoli. Okay, the next topic. The next topic will be the digestive system, which will be set up much like this. We'll have the video crew coming in. We're going to be doing the same thing. In here, I'll have the digestive tract, things on the board.